half, it's a whole city of private contractors. And the same thing with the CIA. Half of their operatives are private contractors. We've seen a privatization, as we heard earlier. Education is being privatized. Public services are being privatized. The problem with that is that when you have a for-profit military defense industrial complex, their motive is to keep a lot of these natural disasters and wars going. And that's not good for human rights. And so that's a very negative force that we all have to be quite clear about. Same thing with the other, like the IMF structural adjustment programs that were imposing very serious hardships on the populations of many countries. Now the IMF is telling the U.S. to get its act in order, which I suppose is somewhat welcome. We're also seeing, in addition to the problems with accountability from private actors, we're seeing more secrecy. You know, as a public company, you at least have to disclose your finances. When you're a private company or you're privatizing government functions, that requirement no longer exists. And so the problem of secrecy and finding out what's going on. People want a normal country, right? You know, we were moving toward a more normal country in the U.S. Now I think we're becoming really more like China in so many different ways. China's the new normal. And so there are these sort of paradigms that are competing. You've got the U.S. model, or at least the way it used to be, of accountability, transparency, openness. You know, we have right to information about the government, or the Chinese model, which is repression and surveillance and so forth. We have to be aware that the tendency that we're seeing in the country today of increased conformity, of decreased tolerance for dissent, these are things that we don't want to encourage. Those trends must be resisted. Now, power doesn't give up its prerogatives easily. You know, that's been throughout history, an observation that's remained true. And it sometimes defends them very aggressively. Assad of Syria, for example, blasted an entire city of 20,000 people, Hama, in 1982. Before we assume that that's just over there, we have to again remember our history and the way that the protesters at the time of the labor rights and the suffragette movement were greeted with harsh force. Even the Republican conventions, the protesters there just a few years ago had the same problem. The anti-globalization protesters in Seattle. So we're seeing actually, it's just a question of whether they use force expressly and use it in terms of explicit force by having people killed in the squares as they're doing in Libya today, or whether it's the sort of more insidious and tacit expression of force, like the preemptive prosecution under material support laws that we heard from Khalil. I'm glad to say, though, that this pushback against the big thieves using the force is quite encouraging. When people like Ben Ali from Tunisia or Mubarak in Egypt are swept out of power, that's a very good sign. It's also a good sign, by the way, when just a couple of weeks ago, George Bush wasn't able to travel to Geneva because of threat for prosecution as a war criminal. Did you see that? Quite welcome. And Rumsfeld, Gonzalez, and so forth are having trouble traveling for the same reason. Through it all, we have to see the realities. And this is something the protesters are doing. They finally woke up to the realities. They were experiencing them, but they always thought that the realities abroad was, it's going to be impossible for us to resist someone like Ben Ali or Mubarak in Egypt. And yet, we see now this encouraging effort to do so, to confront the dictators, and we have to start doing that here at home as well. It's hard to do that when you've got now a situation in the U.S. that counter-reality is the new normal, right? You've got Fox TV, literally just spouting lies. I don't even watch Fox TV anymore. I think they're like trolls on the internet. You really have to resist that sort of thing. It's also like Gaddafi's speech a few days ago. Did you hear that? When he talked about, this is just, kids taking hallucinatory drugs, and it's sponsored by Al-Qaeda. This is out of touch with reality. So the facts, let me just repeat some facts to put us in context here. 9/11 did not occur as a result of some lack of governmental power. The facts, the experts, the 9/11 Commission itself has a lot of stuff on this. It's quite clear that it was a failure to connect the dots. Sybil Edmonds just a few days ago had another disclosure. She's the FBI whistleblower, where she was apparently given intelligence before 9/11 that there would be so-called kamikaze bombers, and there was a little hint of the aviation attacks even in that. But there were many, many indications that the CIA and the FBI had on the radar screen. Just read James Bamford's book, The Shadow Factory, if you want to know more about it. We knew that these people were there. We just didn't get the information out. So there wasn't a legal wall that had to be remedied by the Patriot Act. That's a myth. It was more turf battles between the CIA, between the FBI, and within these organizations. It was human error, in other words. And even if it's a lesser scale, but Obama's complicity in the surveillance state, I think, it shares some characteristics with some of the closed societies that we're seeing toppling across the Middle East and North Africa. They don't see, for example, that the security that you get through such repressive measures is a very brittle security. It's very fragile. And it can, as we heard earlier today, be shattered in an instant. Whether it's ubiquitous surveillance, whether it's kidnapping, a lot of these countries where there are revolts were our former allies. We sent people to be tortured in Morocco. We sent people to be tortured in Egypt and Jordan and so forth. So we have to realize that these attitudes of the elites are quite connected globally, and they're not listening to people, and that must change. It leads to a reaction that basically brings reality back in a big way. As another example of the failure to recognize reality, also think of the cases that Khalil talked about entrapment and stings. There's a lot of concern about homegrown terrorism today, and there should be a concern about homegrown terrorism. But I'd have two responses. Number one is a lot of these cases really are stings and agent provocateurs. They're people that wouldn't have been terrorists unless they were created by the law enforcement authorities. So that's one comment. The other comment I would make is that, these measures are often taken and the radicalization occurs because of human rights violations. If you think about what the bombers in London, for example, said on their videotape, they said, until you stop killing our people, raping our women, bombing our civilians, we will defend ourselves. So it's often human rights violations, whether it's occupation or the drones that kill thousands of civilians in the attempt to capture a handful of terrorists. It's those sorts of things that lead to an inevitable violence and backlash. So it's repression, human rights violations, that leads to true insecurity. And at the extremes, it leads to the violent backlash that we know as terrorism, where they go overboard and actually kill civilians. So we have to recognize that our support for dictators, our support for repression actually helped produce Al-Qaeda. Not figuratively, not theoretically, but literally. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 to Osama bin Laden, he actually came from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is not a terrorist organization in Cairo. The Muslim Brotherhood, although it's quite scary because of what you hear on Fox TV, they're reviled by Al-Qaeda because they don't engage in terrorism, because they don't engage in the harsh measures. But Ayman al-Zawahiri himself, and other members of Al-Qaeda were radicalized because they were tortured, put in prison, treated abusively. They weren't able to speak out. They didn't have free speech. And so they actually had to react with violent methods, is where that's their mindset. So we have to remember that these methods actually create terrorism if we don't control them. Now, just some other observations about what's happening very briefly over there. The importance of nonpartisanship, of coalitions and cooperation. None of the revolutions that we've seen have been a single party. They've often been youth-driven. In Egypt, for example, the techno-youth from Google on Facebook were cooperating now with the Muslim Brotherhood. So they take a critical mass, lots of people. So what you need to do, as activists in Dallas, is to build it much beyond our preaching to the choir, type audience here. We really need to spread the word, especially to people that disagree with us. Especially as a lawyer, I'm with the American Constitution Society. I need to talk to the Federalist Society. As a Democrat, I need to talk to Republicans and so forth. So that's very important. Coalitions, nonpartisanship. The Tea Party has one of the best things going in this area. If you've heard Rand Paul on the Patriot Act, I could not say it better myself. Look up Rand Paul on the Patriot Act on YouTube and you'll see what I'm talking about. The other things I see just noticing what they're doing abroad is the importance of working at every level. As with the successes at Farmer Branch here in Dallas, the Patriot Act resolution, the successful efforts we've had to call attention to the issues and highlight civil rights, civil liberties violations at home, they're doing it abroad. They're working at every level. As an example of that, look at the defections at the top. It's not just the Libyan youth. It started with them. It started with the Egyptian youth and with the labor unions and so forth, but it rapidly spread to the point where now they've got the UN representative from Libya helping them. You've got Ben Ali's wife literally pushing him onto the plane in Tunisia. So these are important things to observe. It takes a combination of bottom up and top down and everybody in the middle. You have to try to scale it, get a lot of people working. The other thing is it's a marathon and not a sprint. These efforts have been going on for years. The democracy and movement in Egypt, the civil society efforts there have been ruthlessly crushed, but they've kept coming back, And, I was very pleased to see Said Ibrahim return to Egypt just in the last few days, the famous democracy activist, going home to be able to celebrate and participate in the democratization of that society. So it takes patience. The Fourth Amendment we talked about, that was after the original Constitution. Basically giving rights to citizens of whatever color and of whatever gender. The vote for women. It takes a lot of time sometimes, but if you continue to ride what Martin Luther King called the arc of history, the arc of the moral universe, it really does bend toward justice. But it does take persistence. You're part of the solution. The importance of youth. We don't have enough youth in this room, and I'd like to echo that comment. We really need to get more youth involved. So let's not forget that. And then, of course, courage. Another of my favorite quotes is the Niemöller quote that Khalil read. First they came for the communists, the trade unionists, and so forth, and there was no one there for me. So we have to see the solidarity and have the courage to speak up for others when others' rights are affected. And the final thing I'll say about what's happening abroad is that this is about countervailing power, as you said, Halsey. It's about rights are about countervailing power. Whether it's a government or a corporation, rights give us the ability to use our own human dignity, our own self-expression, our identity to speak up against repression. Now let me just quickly race through the topics here to give you an update on where we are with the Patriot Act and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The Patriot Act, as all of you know, I'm sure, was enacted within weeks of 9/11 without even being read by Congress, and it amended the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and about 17 other privacy laws. FISA itself was not a bad act. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was enacted after the abuses of the mid-'70s, after the Church Committee found out that Martin Luther King, civil rights leaders, and journalists and congressmen and citizens had been spied on, and protests had been repressed, and so forth. That's exactly the sort of thing we're seeing again now. And I'm just appalled to see that President Obama's FBI, his Department of Justice, was involved in FBI raids of groups exactly like the Dallas Peace Center, exactly like the local peace and solidarity groups, that merely because of what Khalil referenced, expressing solidarity with the Palestinians or the Kurdish people in the northern part of Iraq or the southern part of Turkey, that can now get you put on a list of terrorist sympathizers. No due process of law. And that's a really dangerous situation to be in. The explication you heard of Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, the decision of the Supreme Court, divided decision from last June, horribly wrong decision, is a matter of law in my opinion, but it's also immensely counterproductive. If we can't give peaceful assistance to people that are currently terrorists in order to encourage them to go into peace and human rights as opposed to violence, what prospect is there going to be for greater peace in the world, right? So that's the sort of thing that's really terrible. The status of the Patriot Act, which basically revised FISA to diminish the weak protections in FISA even further, it eliminated generally a lot of checks and balances, a lot of requirements for probable cause, for individualized fact-based suspicion under the Constitution's Fourth Amendment. The Patriot Act has now been renewed, and this is the new normal that we started in. It's been renewed several times. The latest, I'm pleased to say, was only 3 months. And I think that was only because a lot of people spoke up. We had a lobby day in Washington in January. The Bill of Rights Defense Committee, ACLU, and so forth, met with a lot of Congress people and senators face to face. And the result is we have an extension of 3 months within which to operate. But on May 27th, the Patriot Act will be renewed again. And it's only, by the way, 3 provisions that are up for renewal. The roving wiretaps provision, the lone wolf provision, and the Section 215 so-called library provision. The entire rest of the Patriot Act, including the material support provision, is going to continue. What Khalil didn't tell you is that the material support law that the Supreme Court upheld was expanded under the Patriot Act, so that expert assistance